So Josh has been playing Gotham Knights for us, and if you could sum it up in one sentence, if that is possible, what would you say?
It's pretty clear that it doesn't know what it wants to be, and that sort of tension is palpable from the first story mission through to the upteenth time that you hand in a repeatable quest to the Penguin for a small bundle of XP and crafting resources that you will never be able to identify. So that's kind of Gotham Knights thing, is that it's trying to do a lot of things. It's just not really doing any of them very well.
Wow. Okay. That's really interesting, considering I know it's not an Arkham game, and I know everyone compares it to an Arkham game though, but this is a studio that did make an Arkham game, and the Arkham games had they had a through line. They knew exactly what they were.
Regardless of what they've said all throughout, which is that this isn't part of the Arkhamverse, it's a new thing. Batman has always cast a long shadow over Gotham, and he also casts a long shadow over Gotham Knights. And I think part of the issue is that you've got these four all disciples of Batman's teachings, but they all handle very differently, or should. However, they are all essentially, they're not palette swaps, but it's close. Like, they kind of handle the same, they kind of move the same, they kind of have the same basic combat abilities, which doesn't really work. Like, if you think about Batman Arkham Knight, which came out in 2015, one of the reasons that game works so well is that it had a really core fantasy at the heart of it, which was that everything you did in that game, everything that it allowed you to do, fed into this idea that you were the world's greatest detective. Every single thing it did was making you feel like you were Batman. All of these characters have been in this world for a very long time, so it doesn't really make any sense that they are underpowered enough that they require you to craft level 5 Tomfers,
okay,
or,
right,
a level 8 power suit or something.
The story is very undercut where Nightwing is like, oh, I can't take down this brute, and you're like, I'm sorry, I need to get better gear. Do they even do the thing where, oh, we've lost all our gear?
They kind of do a little bit of a we've lost the gear, because Batman dies at the start. That's no spoiler.
In the first trailer.
Batman dies at the start, the Batcave gets destroyed. All of the gear is quote unquote lost, except some stuff that they were able to put in the Belfry, which is the clock.
Or they had at home underneath their bed.
Right.
I've got my original Robin Tonfers.
I think that would be, you could overlook that if the other elements were stronger. So, for example, the game is structured between, you go to the Belfry to go on to story missions. So there's a main storyline about investigating who killed Bruce and the Court of Owls, what are they doing in the city, and then there's all these side cases. Harley Quinn's up to no good, Mr. Freeze is stealing cold stuff so that he can make it cold in Gotham.
You've got to do some Uber Eats deliveries for Penguin because reasons unknown. So like those, you do that, and then you go out into Gotham. It is quite pretty at times, but it's also empty, like staggeringly empty. So you're, navigating this space, largely from the Bat Cycle, and this thing, moves so slowly. Like, it just moves so slowly, and the frame rate's like stuttering around it. Oh, no.
And you have really stilted movement.
Because it's also, is it 30?
It's 30 frames per second, yeah. And it handles in missions, it's pretty solid, but out in the world, it doesn't quite gel. Like, it stutters when you grapple to rooftops, and
eek,
when you're trying to weave this Bat Cycle between the very limited amount of sort of traffic that's out there. There's not really any collision detection, so it kind of just bounces off of whatever.
So when you eventually do get to a mission, or is that then good?
So, and then you get to the missions. They are quite well structured. They do some fairly solid storytelling through it. And the problem with the missions is it doesn't have the fluidity of the Arkham games. And I think that's something that a lot of people are going to come in expecting and are going to be quite disappointed by the result. So the thing is, Arkham Knight set a fairly high bar in terms of combat. It had that really good
sort of syncopation, that rhythm where you're sort of gliding between different enemies and there's big crowds and you're leaping over them and throwing, enemies into the environment, and it's just this whole, you feel like you're in command of every situation you're in. And in Gotham Knights, you're it always feels like you're just slamming against one enemy at a time. And there are these momentum abilities you unlock, but they're quite limited in the way they really change the composition of combat, and also kind of buried beneath the UI, so it's quite easy to forget that they're even there. So really all you're doing is just, slamming enemies one at a time.
Wow.
So, it's...
Bit of a fall from grace.
It is disappointing. And the thing is, there is fun to be had in short bursts. Like, the combat is quite nicely animated. Something that I got a sense of early on was just sort of where you could almost see the limitations of the combat system. And
so initially you're thinking, it'll expand past this. And you're like, no, it's four punches and then a takedown and that's it. And you're like, what? So even with 4 different characters, which to be fair, you have just said feel kind of the same, there's only different tweaks. Even with 4 different characters, the combat still does not feel varied, different, exciting, fluid.
You can change between any of the characters at the Belfry before missions, and they also scale level with one another. So if you spent 4 or 5 hours playing as Batgirl, and unlocked a couple of ability points and what have you, and then you're like, I want to take Red Hood out. He will have also gained those ability points. You can then invest that and do some crafting to get a suit that will work for him at the power level and then take him out. Because there has to be that interchangeability, there's not that much difference between them. So, there is a little bit. Like, Nightwing is technically more acrobatic and has the ability to unlock an extra dodge, for example. Red.
Ooh, you're spoiling us.
And obviously you factor in 2-player co-op, and again, you could in theory spend a lot of time building specific pieces. You could build specific pieces of equipment that complement some of your abilities and the mod you can unlock to augment the suits. So let's say you really wanted, Robin to attack with elemental damage, and you wanted everything geared towards that. You could, and it would be slightly different than the other Robin that your buddy's playing as, or their version of Nightwing, or Batgirl, or whatever. But it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Like, to be honest, the crafting system was so both obtuse in terms of the resources that it was giving you and flat in terms of the depth that I just found myself pouring points into whatever got me up a level as quickly as possible so I could go and do the next story mission
to get it done.
Not to get it done, just because there's so little to do out in the open world.
Wow.
That if you aren't able to do the crafted story stuff,
which is locked behind levels.
Yes. So there's level boundaries. Let's say you want to go and do, part 4 of Harley Quinn's series of missions. That might be behind a level 17 to 21 gate, and you can go in there if you're lower than that. It just, I found in one mission where I realized I was slightly underleveled. I'd managed to get all the way through to the very last boss battle. And speaking of boss battles, they are all horrendous.
Oh no.
So boring. Just the worst example of basic waves, basic routines, and it is, especially if you're playing single player rather than co-op, it is a slog to get anything with a health bar down to 0.
So they bring in these amazing characters of all this depth, of all this history, all these different things they can do with them, all these mechanics, let's bring that in, that random, because they've gone a bit cartoony, comic-y with this. There's an edge to it. So they've given themselves a bit of leeway to do some weirder stuff. And you're saying that it's just boss battles are just wave upon wave upon wave, big health bar, bullet sponge or punch sponge, and that's it.
Yeah.
Roll out
of the way of the red attacks.
Stun, punch, run away.
Basically, it's just a bit monotonous. And that mission I was just talking about, I'd gotten all the way through it under-leveled by 2 or 3 levels. And it was only on the 3rd phase of this encounter, so it's here's a boss and some waves, and then it's here's a different boss and some waves. and oh, now you have to fight both bosses together and also disarm bombs at the same time. And it was an absolute nightmare. And it wasn't until, 20, 30 minutes of bashing my head against it, I was like, oh wait, I'm under leveled to do this. And then I went into the menus to craft a better suit because I realized that was the problem. You can't equip the suits unless you go back to the Belfry. So I just had to quit out of the entire mission, go back to the Belfry, equip the thing, go back and replay the entire thing all over again, which was a nightmare. And now personally, I would like to think that I'm just that good at video games that I was able to get through that entire mission only to stumble at the last hurdle. But I think in reality, if you're going to level gate missions, it should have kicked the shit out of me right at the start.
Yep.
So I gone, oh, wait a minute.
Or checkpoints you.
Or checkpoint me.
Because then you're like, hey, you were under-leveled, but you got this far. Well done. You just do the boss again. So I get the feeling that the people that they're aiming this game at, considering they're bringing in these established characters and they're not necessarily giving a lot of backstory, they're aiming this at fans of the Arkham game, fans of the comic book, fans who know this already and they love these characters. If you're coming at this as a fan and biased in a positive way, is it still that bad?
I think there is enjoyment to be found in it, but this isn't on the level of any of the Arkham games. In terms of the characters, that was something that drew me to it. Like, I always loved Dick Grayson and Nightwing and Barbara Gordon, Batgirl, so I was excited to play as a game as one of those characters. So I think from that perspective, like, it is interesting. I would say some of the characterization isn't great. Like, Dick Grayson is super goody and honestly, this is no joke. There was one mission where he was being so self-congratulatory every time he beat an enemy, just like, oh yeah, that's what you get when you come up against Nightwing. And I was just like, dude, and I honestly, I paused the game and I was like, why did I buy all those Nightwing comics when I was a kid? Nightwing sucked. Went back to the Belfry, changed away from him, and didn't play again as him for hours.
Wow.
So I think, honestly, even if you're coming in for one character, it really depends on how you find their portrayal. Like, something that...
Didn't even think about that.
Yeah, and like, Barbara Gordon was tough, because I know this sounds like such a small complaint, but her hair kind of looks like a Lego block, and is constantly clipping through both the cape and her clothes. And while Gotham can be quite beautiful, the lighting in particular, like, it's obviously dark every time you see it and rainy, and the way the neon lights sort of reflect from the puddles, and you're looking out and you're like, oh, this looks pretty good.
And then just in front of you, there's Barbara Gordon's hair going clipping through, and you're like, slightly ruined that.
It might annoy you, you might not care. Same with the way that the frame rate kind of stutters when you're driving around.
See, that's the thing for me. If it's 30, if you've dropped the PS4 and the Xbox stuff to focus on it, then having slightly clipping hair and kind of locked at 30, when you've got stuff like the Bat bike with the boost and you're trying to go through, I'm like, well, either don't give us the boost on the Bat bike or something and then put it down to 30 and we won't notice it as much. I'm not sure how acceptable it is, really.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is ultimately going to come down to that combat, and it is fun in small bursts, and it is largely inoffensive, but it just lacks any real defining characteristic that sets it apart from anything else. And like all co-op games, everything you do in life is better with friends. If you're doing something with a friend, it is more fun. And realistically, they've clearly had to make concessions in the game to support the co-op. And personally, I don't think it's all worked. I don't think it's a horrendous game. It's not broken. It's just quite average in everything that it tries to do.
With that in mind, then, what score have you given it?
Gotham Knights is going to get a 2.5 out of 5.